What is required and what must be made manifest. Author, Othniel Max Daves. Date, April 2, 2026. Democracy without wisdom, understanding, moral and ethical foundations, personal responsibility, and comprehension of reality is not self-government. It is chaos pretending to be. One has to govern their own appetites and behaviors to have self-government. Likewise, it takes a respect for one's fellow citizens. The same goes for the representative form of democracy. Selfishness, self-absorption, ignorance, and corruption are enemies of self-government. This becomes obvious in times of trouble and crisis, for it is these that the best and worst comes out and is revealed in the citizenry. Likewise, lawlessness tolerated is an abdication of the citizens' duty for their self-government. If they wish to be complicit with the evils that destroy society or cannot agree on what evil is in society, you do not have a self-governed nation. You have chaos and dissipation, which leads to desolation and destruction. What follows from that condition is not merely political dysfunction, but systemic unraveling across every layer of the republic. A people unwilling or unable to exercise internal restraint will inevitably demand external control. Where self-governance fails at the individual level, governance does not disappear. It metastasizes. Authority expands to fill the vacuum left by the absence of discipline, judgment, and shared moral reference. What was once governed by conscience must then be governed by coercion. This is not theoretical, it is observable across history and institutional behavior. The loss of internal order produces an exponential increase in external regulation, surveillance, and enforcement. At that point, the language of freedom is often retained, but its substance is hollowed out. Rights persist in name while becoming increasingly conditional in practice. The citizen is no longer a steward of liberty, but a managed participant within an administratively controlled system. This transition is subtle at first, justified by crisis, rationalized by necessity, but it becomes self-reinforcing. Disorder produces intervention, intervention produces dependency. Dependency erodes the remaining capacity for self-governance. Compounding this is the degradation of shared reality. A self-governing people must possess a baseline capacity to perceive and agree upon what is true. When truth itself becomes fragmented, whether through manipulation, ideological capture, or willful denial, consensus collapses. Without a shared understanding of reality, there can be no coherent standard for justice, no stable foundation for law, and no meaningful accountability. In such an environment, power does not arbitrate truth, it replaces it. This is where the republic becomes particularly vulnerable to what can be described as moral inversion. Behaviors once recognized as destructive are normalized or even celebrated, while virtues necessary for societal continuity, discipline, restraint, integrity, responsibility, are marginalized or dismissed. When a society loses the ability to distinguish between what sustains it and what degrades it, it enters a phase of accelerated entropy. The system begins to consume itself. Crisis acts as the revealing force. It strips away narrative insulation and exposes underlying character, both individually and collectively. In stable periods, a nation can mask its deficiencies through abundance, momentum, or inherited institutional strength. In crisis, those buffers collapse. What remains is the true operating condition of the people, their level of discipline, their capacity for sacrifice, their clarity of thought, and their moral orientation. If those foundations are weak, crisis does not merely challenge the system, it breaks it. From there, the trajectory is historically consistent. Internal fragmentation invites external pressure. Loss of coherence invites opportunism, whether from rival states, internal factions, or emergent power structures. The nation becomes reactive rather than strategic, divided rather than unified, managed rather than self-directed. What began as a failure of personal governance scales upward into national vulnerability. The restoration of self-government, therefore, cannot begin at the institutional level alone. It is not primarily a structural problem, though it manifests structurally. It is a human problem. A republic is downstream of the character of its people. Laws can restrain behavior to a point, but they cannot manufacture virtue. Systems can incentivize outcomes, but they cannot substitute for judgment. Without a citizenry capable of governing itself, its impulses, its perceptions, its responsibilities, no constitutional framework can sustain itself indefinitely. A durable republic requires more than participation. It requires formation. It requires citizens who are capable of discernment, who understand the consequences of action and inaction, who can subordinate immediate appetite to long-term good, and who recognize that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the mastery of it. Without that, what remains is not self-government, but the gradual conversion of liberty into liability, until the system corrects itself through force, collapse, or transformation. The question is not whether governance will occur. It is who, or what, will exercise it, and on what basis. If this is addressed to Americans specifically, then it must be stated plainly. The condition described is not abstract. It is present, measurable, and cumulative. You are not merely witnessing political disagreement. You are observing the erosion of the prerequisites required for a self-governing people to exist at all. A republic does not fail in a single moment. It degrades through a sequence of tolerated compromises, moral, intellectual, and civic, until the underlying structure can no longer support itself. The first obligation, therefore, is not to reform Washington as if it were an isolated malfunction. Washington is an output. It reflects, amplifies, and exploits the condition of the citizenry that sustains it. A disordered population will produce disordered leadership, regardless of party, platform, or personality. If the inputs remain unchanged, the outputs will continue to converge toward the same result. This requires a recalibration of responsibility. Self-government begins where excuses end. It begins with the recognition that discipline is not oppression, that truth is not negotiable, and that responsibility cannot be outsourced indefinitely without consequence. A citizen who cannot govern his own impulses, consumption, anger, distraction, indulgence, cannot meaningfully participate in governing a nation. The scale changes, the principle does not. You are being conditioned, whether consciously recognized or not, toward passivity and fragmentation. Constant distraction erodes attention. Narrative saturation erodes discernment. Incentive structures reward outrage over understanding, reaction over reflection, and identity over principle. These are not incidental dynamics, they are systemic pressures that degrade the cognitive and moral capacity required for self-governance. The countermeasure is deliberate and difficult. It requires the reestablishment of intellectual discipline, the ability to distinguish signal from noise, fact from manipulation, and complexity from obfuscation. It requires moral clarity, the willingness to call destructive behavior what it is, even when it is culturally normalized or politically convenient. It requires personal accountability, the acceptance that your actions, however small, contribute to the aggregate condition of the nation. Equally, it requires a restoration of civic seriousness. Citizenship is not a spectator activity. It is not limited to periodic voting or performative expression. It involves participation in local institutions, engagement with community, and a willingness to uphold standards even when doing so carries social or personal cost. A nation cannot be sustained by passive beneficiaries. It requires active stewards. There is also a requirement for shared standards. A society that cannot agree on basic definitions, truth, justice, harm, responsibility, cannot maintain cohesion. Disagreement is not the issue, fragmentation is. The ability to argue within a shared framework is a strength. The inability to recognize any framework at all is a precursor to collapse. History is unambiguous on this point. Republics do not lose themselves solely through external conquest. More often they erode internally until they can no longer resist external pressure or internal fracture. The loss of self-governance precedes the loss of sovereignty. This is not a call for nostalgia or a return to some imagined past. It is a recognition of functional requirements. Any society, modern or ancient, that seeks to sustain liberty must meet certain conditions. Those conditions are not ideological, they are structural. Remove them, and the system will reconfigure itself, often in ways that are less free, more controlled, and increasingly difficult to reverse. The path forward is neither quick nor externally imposed. It is incremental, distributed, and rooted in individual and collective recalibration. It begins with a decision to pursue truth over convenience, discipline over impulse, responsibility over entitlement, and stewardship over neglect. The alternative is not ambiguity. It is a predictable trajectory toward greater disorder, followed by imposed order, one that will not ask for consent in the way a self-governing system once did. A republic is sustained by what its people are willing to consistently practice, not merely what they claim to value. The distinction between those two determines whether self-government remains viable or becomes a historical footnote. What has accelerated this decline is not merely the presence of lawlessness, but the normalization, and in many cases the active celebration of it. A society does not drift into disorder solely because rules are broken. It collapses when the breaking of those rules is reframed as virtue, when restraint is recast as oppression, and when the enforcement of standards is treated as the greater offense than their violation. At that point, lawlessness is no longer episodic, it becomes cultural. A significant portion of Americans have crossed that threshold. Not only has unlawful behavior been tolerated, it has been rationalized, justified, and at times demanded to be left unrestrained. The language surrounding it is often moralized, presented as justice, expression, or necessity, while the underlying reality is the erosion of shared constraints that make coexistence possible. This is not a sustainable equilibrium. It is a destabilizing force. The consequences are not abstract, nor are they confined to those directly engaged in such behavior. Lawlessness operates as a contagion within a system. Once it is selectively permitted, excused in one domain, for one group, or under one justification, it establishes a precedent that cannot be cleanly contained. Others observe it, adapt to it, and respond in kind. Trust erodes. Compliance becomes conditional. The expectation of order dissolves into a negotiation of power, perception, and proximity. From there, second-order effects begin to compound. Institutions, recognizing the erosion of voluntary compliance, respond with increased control mechanisms. Enforcement becomes uneven or overcorrective. Entire populations, many of whom did not participate in the initial breakdown, are subjected to broader restrictions, surveillance, or reduced freedoms as a means of reestablishing baseline order. The paradox is unavoidable. Tolerated lawlessness produces expanded control over everyone. Economically, the effects are equally direct. Markets rely on predictability, enforceable contracts, and a baseline level of trust. When lawlessness increases, whether through theft, fraud, regulatory evasion, or systemic manipulation, costs rise, risk premiums expand, investment contracts, entire communities experience decline as stability becomes uncertain. The burden is distributed, not isolated. Socially, the fragmentation deepens. When standards are no longer applied consistently, citizens begin to self-segregate, physically, economically, and ideologically. Parallel systems emerge, different rules for different groups, different expectations in different spaces. This is not pluralism, it is disintegration. A nation cannot function indefinitely as a collection of competing moral and legal microenvironments. Most critically, those who advocate for unrestrained lawlessness often fail to account for its recursive nature. The forces they justify today do not remain aligned with their interests tomorrow. Disorder does not recognize allegiance. It expands until it encounters resistance, and when it does, that resistance is rarely calibrated or selective. It is blunt, systemic, and frequently overreaching. This is the pattern that history repeatedly demonstrates. Tolerance of disorder leads not to sustained freedom, but to a corrective phase that is far less restrained than the order it replaced. There is also a deeper issue at play, one of moral coherence. A society that selectively defines lawfulness based on preference or affiliation forfeits its claim to justice. Without consistency, law becomes an instrument rather than a standard, and when law becomes an instrument, it is eventually wielded by whoever accumulates sufficient power to control it. For Americans, the implication is direct. You cannot simultaneously demand the benefits of a stable, lawful society while endorsing or excusing the behaviors that undermine it. The system cannot be partitioned in that way. The degradation you permit or celebrate will propagate beyond its initial context and return in forms you do not control. The restoration of order, therefore, is not solely a matter of enforcement. It is a matter of collective refusal to rationalize destructive behavior, refusal to selectively apply standards, and refusal to substitute emotional justification for objective assessment. This requires clarity. Not every grievance justifies every action. Not every cause sanctifies its methods. A line must exist, and it must be maintained, not sporadically, but consistently. Without that, the distinction between justice and disorder collapses entirely. The cost of failing to draw that line is not borne by an abstract system. It is borne by the nation as a whole, economically, socially, and structurally. And it is borne inevitably by those who believe they could stand outside the consequences of the conditions they helped create. No one stands outside a collapsing framework. Government, properly understood, is not an arbitrary human invention. It is an ordained mechanism of restraint, established to check lawlessness, preserve order, and create the conditions under which justice, mercy, and human flourishing can exist. This principle is articulated most explicitly in the Bible, particularly in passages such as Romans 13, where governing authority is described as a servant for good, bearing the sword against wrongdoing. The implication is direct and not open to reinterpretation without consequence. Government exists to restrain evil, not to redefine it, excuse it, or participate in it. When a people lose the capacity to discern what is lawful, just, merciful, and wise, they do not merely weaken their institutions, they invert their purpose. When a government, entrusted with that same mandate, becomes corrupted or captured, it ceases to function as a restraining force and instead becomes an accelerant. In either case, whether the failure originates in the citizenry, the leadership, or both, the result is the same: enmity toward the very reason government was established, and by extension, toward the authority that ordained it. This is not a symbolic or theological abstraction. It is a functional reality with observable consequences. A government that no longer restrains lawlessness will either collapse under its weight or expand coercively in an attempt to reassert control after the fact. A people who no longer recognize or respect lawful boundaries will generate instability that no system can indefinitely absorb. When both conditions occur simultaneously, corrupt governance and undisciplined citizenry, the system enters a phase of compounded degradation. At that point, judgment is not imposed arbitrarily. It is the natural outcome of systemic violation. Disorder produces consequence. Injustice produces correction. The structure itself begins to fail because it is no longer aligned with the principles that sustain it. Critically, the effects are not contained to those directly responsible. The lawlessness of the few, especially when tolerated, excused, or celebrated by the many, propagates across the entire nation. It distorts markets, erodes trust, weakens institutions, and invites both internal fragmentation and external pressure. The innocent do not remain insulated. Infrastructure degrades, economic stability declines, public safety diminishes, and the burden of correction falls broadly rather than selectively. This is one of the most consistent patterns in both scriptural and historical record. Collective consequence emerges from tolerated corruption. The failure, therefore, is not merely an action, but an abdication. When citizens refuse to uphold standards, when leaders refuse to enforce them, and when society refuses to agree upon them, the system no longer functions as intended. It becomes something else entirely: unstable, reactive, and increasingly coercive. To reject the restraining purpose of government is to reject the conditions necessary for ordered liberty. To reject the moral and ethical framework that underpins it is to remove the compass by which justice is defined. What remains is not freedom, but a contest of power, one that inevitably produces outcomes far more severe than the order it displaced. The conclusion is unavoidable. A nation cannot sustain itself in opposition to the very principles that justify its existence. When it does, the consequences are not delayed indefinitely. They accumulate, converge, and ultimately manifest at scale, for all, not just for some. This same pattern expresses itself with particular clarity in the economic domain. An economy is not morally neutral. It is a reflection of the governing philosophy and the character of the people operating within it. Where lawfulness, restraint, and stewardship are present, economic systems tend toward what can be described as regenerative, systems that create durable value, reinvest in productive capacity, and sustain both people and place over time. Where those qualities are absent, economies drift toward extraction, systems that consume value faster than they produce it, concentrating gain while externalizing cost. The connection to lawfulness is direct. When a society tolerates or celebrates forms of lawlessness, whether overt or institutional, it creates the conditions for extractive behavior to dominate. Contracts become instruments of advantage rather than mutual obligation. Financial systems prioritize short-term gain over long-term stability. Regulatory frameworks are manipulated or selectively enforced. In such an environment, the incentive structure rewards those who can extract the most, the fastest, with the least accountability. This is not merely a market failure, it is a moral and structural failure. Extractive economics is, at its core, lawlessness formalized. It is the scaling of the same principle, taking without regard for consequence, benefiting without corresponding responsibility, and operating without alignment to truth or restraint. It may be codified, legitimized, or rationalized, but its effects are consistent. It depletes rather than builds. It fragments rather than integrates. It destabilizes rather than sustains. A regenerative economic model operates on an entirely different premise. It assumes that value must be created, not merely transferred. It recognizes that systems, whether agricultural, industrial, financial, or social, must be maintained and renewed if they are to endure. It aligns incentives with stewardship, durability, and reciprocity. In such a system, capital is deployed not only for return, but for resilience. Production is tied to real outputs, not abstract manipulation. Communities are participants in value creation, not merely substrates from which value is extracted. The distinction between these two models mirrors the earlier distinction between lawfulness and lawlessness. Where a people and their institutions lose the ability to discern what is just, merciful, and wise, they will inevitably construct economic systems that reflect that confusion. Extraction will be framed as efficiency. Consolidation will be framed as optimization. Dispossession will be framed as progress. Over time, the underlying reality becomes unavoidable. The system consumes its own foundation, labor, land, trust, and productive capacity, until it can no longer sustain itself. This is where the consequences converge at the national level. An extractive system weakens sovereignty by hollowing out domestic capability. It increases dependency on external supply chains, on financial engineering, on continuous intervention to stabilize imbalances it creates. It amplifies inequality in ways that fracture social cohesion, and it reduces the nation's capacity to respond to crisis because the underlying structures have been optimized for short-term gain rather than long-term endurance. In contrast, a regenerative system reinforces sovereignty. It rebuilds local and regional capacity. It aligns production with real needs and strategic resilience. It distributes opportunity without dissolving accountability. And it creates a feedback loop in which value creation strengthens the system rather than depleting it. The choice between these models is not purely technical. It is moral, cultural, and ultimately theological in its root assumptions. A nation that rejects the restraining principles of lawfulness will default toward extraction, because extraction requires less discipline and offers immediate reward. A nation that restores those principles at both the citizen and institutional level can reorient toward regeneration, because regeneration requires foresight, restraint, and a willingness to invest beyond immediate return. The trajectory is therefore not determined solely by policy, but by alignment. If the people in their government remain misaligned with the principles that restrain lawlessness, the economic system will continue to reflect that disorder, regardless of reform attempts. If alignment is restored, if lawfulness, responsibility, and discernment are reestablished, then the economic structure can be rebuilt on a foundation that sustains rather than consumes. The outcome, as with governance itself, is cumulative. It is the aggregation of countless decisions, individual and institutional, either reinforcing extraction or enabling regeneration. A nation cannot indefinitely extract from its own foundations without consequence. The question is whether those consequences will force a corrective shift toward regeneration, or whether the system will continue to degrade until that shift is no longer optional, but imposed by collapse. The necessary inflection point is not procedural, it is moral. Before systems can be repaired, a people must be willing to examine themselves without deflection. That requires an honest inventory of conduct, of assumptions, of what has been tolerated, excused, or ignored. Not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a disciplined assessment of alignment between what is professed and what is practiced. A nation cannot correct what it refuses to diagnose, and it cannot diagnose what it refuses to see. This applies at both the individual and collective level. It is insufficient to assign fault exclusively to institutions, leaders, or opposing factions. Those are manifestations, not origins. The underlying condition is distributed. It exists in habits, incentives, compromises, and the quiet accommodations made in daily life. A comprehensive inventory will reveal not only overt failures, but the cumulative effect of small abdications, areas where responsibility was deferred, where truth was subordinated to convenience, and where standards were selectively applied. Division, as it is currently practiced, will not resolve this. Fragmentation along ideological, cultural, or partisan lines does not produce clarity. It obscures it. Each side constructs a partial narrative, amplifies it, and then treats it as complete. The result is not correction but escalation, parallel realities competing rather than a shared framework being restored. A house divided at the level of truth cannot generate coherent action at the level of policy or practice. It will oscillate, react, and degrade. The corrective path requires a different posture. It requires a recommitment to truth as a governing standard, truth that is sought, tested, and accepted, even when it contradicts preference or affiliation. Without that, every subsequent effort is built on unstable ground. It requires the reintroduction of justice, not as selective enforcement or emotional reaction, but as consistent application of right order. It requires mercy, not as permissiveness toward destructive behavior, but as a disciplined capacity to restore without abandoning standards. And it requires love, not as sentiment, but as an orientation toward the good of others and the whole, rather than the elevation of self. None of these can operate effectively without humility. Humility is the prerequisite for correction because it allows for the recognition of error, personal and collective. Without it, every failure is externalized, every critique is deflected, and every reform attempt becomes performative. Coupled with humility must be courage, the willingness to act on what is recognized as true, even when doing so incurs cost, resistance, or isolation. Insight without action does not alter trajectory. The integration of these elements, truth, justice, mercy, love, humility, and courage, constitutes more than moral language. It is a functional framework for restoration. Each component addresses a failure mode currently present, confusion, inconsistency, harshness or permissiveness, self-interest, pride, and fear. Together, they form the conditions under which a self-governing people can reestablish coherence. This is not a guarantee of immediate resolution. It is a necessary condition for any durable solution to emerge. The scale of the problem reflects the scale of neglect. It has developed over time and will require sustained effort to reverse. But the trajectory is not fixed. Systems respond to alignment. When enough individuals and institutions begin to operate under restored principles, feedback loops shift. Trust can be rebuilt. Standards can be reestablished. Capacity can be regenerated. The alternative, continued division without introspection, offers no viable path forward. It perpetuates the very conditions that produce the current state, ensuring that deterioration continues under different labels. The decision, therefore, is not abstract. It is operational. It is whether to persist in fragmentation, blame, and selective standards, or to undertake the more difficult work of alignment, beginning with the self and extending outward. A nation capable of the latter retains the possibility of renewal. A nation that refuses it will experience the consequences of its refusal, not as theory, but as lived reality. Restoration is possible. It is not automatic. It requires a people willing to confront themselves with clarity, to reorder their priorities with discipline, and to act with integrity across the domains they inhabit. Only then can the larger structure begin to reflect something other than the disorder it currently amplifies. As for people, so too for the nation. Respectfully, Othniel Max Daves.